welcome to another presentation of A Living History of Bronxville. Tonight I am absolutely delighted to have as our guest speaker Robert P. Marshall, known to us as Bob, and also not to be confused with his father, who is Robert P. Marshall Sr. You're junior, right?
Correct.
And of course, many of you know his mother, Millie. Robert is joining us tonight to speak about a new book on Bronxville artists that's going to be forthcoming when? In the next month or so?
Well, we hope by November.
By November, a little longer than
in time for Christmas.
In time for Christmas. Please don't forget that. And we thought we would begin just first of all by learning a little bit about Bob and how he got involved in playing a very major role in putting this book together. And then I think we'll discuss a little bit about the book and the artists that are covered in the book. I think you will find it absolutely fascinating. It certainly is a part of Bronxville history. Bob, now, you weren't born in Bronxville. When did you come to Bronxville? Where?
I was born in Tennessee, my mother's home, and we moved here when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And we lived on Brook Avenue for 4 or 5 years, and then moved to Plateau Circle in 1955, I believe.
Your parents are still in that home?
My parents still live, right.
Yeah. And then you went to school here in the Bronxville school system?
I went to school here from 4th through 9th grade, then went away to Andover, and then went on to Harvard. Mm-hmm. And then was in the Peace Corps for a couple of years before I came back to law school at Columbia.
Where did you go in the Peace Corps?
I was in Libya for a year until Gaddafi kicked out the Peace Corps.
Oh.
And then I moved to Tunisia for a second year, teaching English in both places.
Mm-hmm. Well, now it's a long way from Tunisia to come back. What did you do when you came back to the States? How did you enter the labor force? And I suppose you went to Columbia Law School. Is that correct?
I went to law school to keep all my options open, as they say, and then went to practice for a small law firm in New York where a former Bronxville mayor, George Shively, was a partner.
Oh, sure, I remember.
And part of the appeal of the firm I went to was they did a lot of publishing work, and they represented Doubleday and some other book publishers. And as I had taught English in the Peace Corps and been editor of a school newspaper and sports editor of my college paper, I'd always been interested in writing and editing and publishing. So it's not all that far a leap. There is a common thread that runs through my academic career and my professional career thereafter.
Are you still with Time Life? No, Time Magazine.
I joined Time Inc. in 1976, and since then I've been a lawyer for Time Magazine. Mm-hmm. Principally a libel lawyer. I read the magazine, try to keep Time from getting sued for libel, and give them any other advice that...
Have you been successful? Have you?
Fortunately not.
Every once in a while.
They get sued, and then we have to defend it. But my goal is to try to let them say as much as they can say and not have to worry about lawyers and lawsuits.
Mm-hmm. That's quite a task to do for Time. Let's move a little bit now to a discussion of this book. Where did this whole book begin? I mean, where did the idea come for doing a book on the artists of Bronxville?
Well, we've had in Lawrence Park a Hilltop association for at least the last 40 years, and before that there was another association in the 1930s. And the Hilltop has always been conscious of its history. It was really one of the first planned communities in the country and the first core suburban development in Bronxville.
You might tell everybody where the Hilltop, for those who don't know where the Hilltop, I mean, what are the streets that sort of define the Hilltop, roughly speaking? I know you.
Well, the Hilltop is a hill that rises up behind where the Hotel Grandin used to be and where the Grandin townhouses are now. Mm-hmm. When William Lawrence came here in 1890, he purchased a large 86-acre farm that now is roughly bounded by Palmfield, Sagamore, Midland, and Avon. If you can imagine that whole area was one piece of property with only one house on it, a number of cow trails, a pond where the school now is for watering the cattle, and really nothing else. And that's the area that Lawrence purchased and turned into Lawrence Park, which was a development of residential houses, or cottages as they were called in those days. Mm-hmm. And the flatland area was developed a bit later. He started off developing the sites on the hillside as you go up Park Avenue, as you go up Valley Road, as you go up Prescott. Those are the main streets, and they rise up the hill, and they have the virtue of having wonderful sights, unobstructed views. The lots are very close together, but they're all very private because of the topography of the hillside that Lawrence and his architect took advantage of.
Cobblestone streets too. I hear tell, just a little bit of a digression. I mean, it's supposed that William Van Dusen Lawrence went there and built homes and then invited artists to come. Now you have a little bit of a different view on whether he really invited. That was his original intention.
What part? This may be a longer digression than you intended, but part of the problem in writing this book, which I didn't write, by the way, but I've edited, is that a lot of Bronxville history has not been recorded when it happened, and I'm sure you've come across this in your program. And a lot of people have taken, for instance, William Lawrence's own words of how he came to start this community, and those words were written 20 or 30 years after the facts occurred. And he wrote it down several times, and each time he wrote it was different. So we've had to try to figure out. Yeah, we don't know. I mean, once he said he came here in 1888, once 89, once 90. That's just a fact. But in terms of what his intentions were, I tend to think that his view that it was intended to be an artist colony from the beginning is somewhat colored by the fact that that's what it turned into. I think it was a bit of luck on his part that the first artist came here in 1894, and he was a pretty well-known artist, and he had friends, and other artists came out to see him, and then they bought houses, and it's now a community of investment bankers. It's not like any guiding force for any mayor.
Today it's
Decided, well, let's invite all the investment bankers to live here. One comes out, then other members of his firm see it's a nice place to live, and they come out and they follow also. I think the same thing happened with artists, who at that time were, I don't want to compare artists and investment bankers, but they were a very desirable class of people. They had a high social standing. If you could get a number of artists to live in your community, it added a certain cachet. It enabled Lawrence to sell houses at a premium by saying this is a very exclusive neighborhood. We have the finest artists of New York City
coming out to live here,
painting portraits,
so
etc.
it sort of happened, do you think? And
I think so.
But he encouraged it after he realized what was happening.
He certainly was very receptive to artistic temperaments and artistic personalities, and he was a patron of a number of artists in his time, and he built a mansion on Fifth Avenue where he lived, adorned with some very fine art. He took trips to Europe almost every year in which he collected antiques and old masters from Europe. There were a number of writers that came here also. This is the kind of person
George Lawrence, we had interviewed
he liked
earlier,
to hang out with.
Junior, and he was saying all these things that you say. Let's go back now. We digressed a little bit to the Hilltop Association. So, I mean, and how did the Hilltop Association come up with this idea for a book? I mean, how did it get going in that group?
Well, I think like you, we wanted to get something down in a more permanent form before memories faded, before houses were lost, while there still was some history in our midst. And actually the first time that the Hilltop Association decided to write a book was maybe 20 years ago, and at that time there were several individuals still living in Lawrence Park who had been born there in 1903, 1904, very early on. Mrs. Warnsice, who was the daughter of Frank Chambers, one of the leading citizens of Bronxville in the 1890s, lived in Lawrence Park at the time. So it was very real. The history was very real at that time. It took a long time after that to translate the idea into practice.
You mean the idea for the book has been 20 years old?
Oh, yes. Yeah. If you look back, as I did for the book, into the minutes of the Hilltop Association every year, there's a decision by the Hilltop Board to prepare a book on the history of Bronxville.
And you are fulfilling a 20 to 25-year dream of the Hilltop Association.
Oh, yes. No, and I moved back in 1981, and every annual meeting we had, they'd have a report from the historian on the progress of the book, which was zero.
Right.
But they always gave a report on the progress. And
but finally one year something changed. I think finally one year you hired Loretta Hoagland, or is that how it began? Can you explain how it finally really began to take seed?
When Bill Ellis was president of the Hilltop Association maybe 7 or 8 years ago, he spoke to, I'm not sure how the connection was made, but we found a woman, a middle-aged woman who was finishing a degree at Sarah Lawrence, who had
Well,
some,
not middle-aged.
well, I mean, she was not a callow 22-year-old, is all I know.
Seasoned.
Who had some writing experience, and she was a student of Professor Bill Park, who lives on Park Avenue.
Sure.
And he connected Loretta with the Hilltop Association, said here's a woman who wants to do some writing, and maybe will be willing to work for what we're willing to pay, which was not much at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so Bill discussed it with the Hilltop Board, and we decided to give her money to do some research and to do a sample chapter,
Mm-hmm.
which the hope was she could then sell to a commercial publisher.
What was the sample chapter like? It covered artists of Bronxville?
It was
or?
what is now the first chapter of the book, which discusses Lawrence arriving in Bronxville, what Bronxville was like, what Lawrence's background was like, and his having the idea to make it an artist colony, and building the first couple houses. It was really setting the stage.
Now, obviously, she wasn't successful in getting a publisher to publish it, or either a magazine to publish it. So then it fell back on the shoulders of the Hilltop Association.
Well, then we decided she'd done all this research and gotten the project started. We didn't want to let momentum lapse and wait another 20 years to find someone else. Mm-hmm. And so we decided to cough up a little more money and say,
you
all right.
assessed the members? They all willingly contributed?
We didn't assess the members. We had some money left over in the treasury, and we built up some with dues each year. And some of the members of the board contributed some funds. And we said, write the book, and we'll see about getting it published, but we want to make sure that we get all the information you've collected down on paper. So she took a couple of years finishing her research, writing what is now 9 chapters of the book, which pretty much tells the story of Bronxville from 1890 to 1929, which is a 40-year period that we concentrated on, which was really the core of Lawrence Park and the development of Bronxville as a suburb.
And did she emphasize what, the artists or the architect? What was her emphasis in this book?
The book starts off, I guess the first emphasis is really the houses, because as you walk around Lawrence Park and other parts of Bronxville as well, you see some remarkable houses, and they cry out to what is their story. You see this house and you wonder, how did it get here, who lived here, who built it.
Now you have some pictures of houses in the book coming up, right?
We have about 80 houses that are
maybe you can point out just a sample right beside you there, Bob, if our cameraman, Bob Duffy, can get this.
Here are one of the earliest houses in Lawrence Park, and we were very fortunate able to find some old photographs. And this was a house that was built in 1892, and we have a picture of it with an artist studio was added 1894 below it. And next to it is a house that was built in 1902, built with the same design as the house in 1892. So this is a
example of what you...
A fun little story involving the houses. Some houses have the same design. This is what's now known as a shingle-style architecture, which is a very interesting to me period of architecture. So the houses were the first thing, because they're there. We know what they are. We can find them.
Right.
The artist took a little more work. Then you found out who lived there. Then we did research on who the artist was. For instance, this picture we obtained from the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme, Connecticut, because the artist who lived there, while he was here during the winter, he spent the summers at an art colony in Old Lyme, and they had material on how that Bronxville did not possess, and so we found an old picture of Bronxville up in Connecticut for the book.
Just to back up for just 1 second, I actually sort of diverted you onto the architecture, but we were beginning to say how this book really got going. The first step was to hire Loretta Hopeland, and she did her bit. Then you became very involved. I understand you first served as editor, and then you moved to legal advisor, and then or one or the other. And
I started as lawyer, because that was my specialty, and I was elected to the Hilltop board. And the main thing the Hilltop Association does is throw parties, and I thought it might get me out of having to throw parties and run square dances if I could say I was going to work on the book. It didn't work. I had to throw the parties and work on the book.
It never works that way.
But as I say, I've always been interested in writing, editing, and publishing, and so this was a fun way to spend my time. So I agreed to be editor of the book project.
Mm-hmm.
I had written a book myself in 1981.
Now, that has an interesting title. What was the book you wrote in 1981?
It's called Diary of a Yankee Hater.
Of a
It's
Yankee.
about the New York Yankees, the era of George Steinbrenner, Reggie Jackson, Billy Martin,
Mm-hmm.
an era that unfortunately is not completely gone. It looks like it may be coming back, but that's another story.
Are you a Yankee hater? Is that?
Oh yes,
you are?
especially if George Steinbrenner
Uh-huh.
wants to run the team again.
This was obviously not a bestseller, or what happened? I mean, it's still in print. Is your book?
Yeah, I have a copy. Can I?
Oh, sure.
Before I came down, I thought I would show this to you. I grabbed off the sticker that said $1, this was found in the remainder bin in 1983, and now it's a collector's item because you can't find it anymore. And the sentiment of hating the New York Yankees, of course, will always be with us, and so the book should be reissued and continually read and taught in school and all those things. But unfortunately, it's not. It pretty much disappeared in 1982, as you suggested.
I cannot bring myself to hate the Yankees, but I can understand why some of those who do. So anyway, you had good credentials. You'd written about the Yankees.
So I was a published author, which
counts for
most
a
people
lot.
in the neighborhood weren't.
Mm-hmm.
So I said I'll be glad to be the editor of the book, and then I started working with Loretta, and we refined the text. And then the text obviously cried out for pictures. All the houses she spoke about, all the artists she spoke about needed to have illustrations. So then we spent probably another year or two collecting photographs and creating new photographs.
I understand it wasn't really we. It was you who went out and took all these photographs, right?
I took most of the photographs. Yeah, I had some help in collecting them. A good friend moved into the neighborhood named Eloise Morgan, and she was very energetic in contacting libraries and museums and descendants of the artists who lived here, and got old photographs from family albums, which had a wonderful historic touch to the book.
Were they very cooperative? Were they?
Oh, everybody is wonderfully cooperative. You realize these are people who were very prominent in 1900, 1910, and now have suffered the obscurity of the passing years, and their children and grandchildren still know of them as artists, but no one else really does. And so when someone calls up and says, I'm doing a book and I want to talk about your grandfather, the artist,
of course,
it's very exciting to them because they feel that they're getting some publicity for their relative's work.
Yeah.
In many cases, the relative should have some more publicity because the paintings are quite good. So we're getting a lot of cooperation from them, and they're correcting errors we're making even as we sit here.
As we sit. That's
here.
why it's been moved back to November, right?
Right.
Yeah. Ever changing. So anyway, so then you became this photographer, and you then really expanded the whole topic of the book more and more as you got into it. Isn't that right?
Well, as we got into it, the story just becomes more and more fascinating the more you learn about it. And the concept that there are 5 major artists of the time living within 100 feet of each other right around Wellington Circle is really flabbergasting when you come to think of it. But we knew who these artists were, but we really didn't know much about their art. And to me the question was, if they were good artists, why had I never heard of them? I mean,
Yes.
I studied art history in college, and I read art books and art magazines, and I didn't know a single one of the names.
Why is that? I mean, how could we have these major artists and they just not be captured?
Well, one answer I'm now finding out is there were an awful lot of artists around the turn of the century. I mean, I can go to exhibitions of turn-of-the-century American artists, which will have paintings by 200 painters, and they won't include any of ours. I mean, they just are very large numbers of painters. But what happened was that they went out of fashion in 1913, 1915. Modern art came in, European art came in, Picasso, Cubism, Fauvism, Post-Impressionism, all the famous artists that you know about. American artists in the Ashcan school developed in Philadelphia and New York, and in America, more realist painters, the gritty reality of American art. There are other new styles. What became popular was what was new. And then, of course, you go on through abstract expressionism in the 50s. And really for a while, the kind of art these artists did was totally out of fashion. And now, or at 10, 15 years ago, of course, everything comes back.
Right.
And now they're rediscovering the art of the French salons, the French academies,
Yeah.
and the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and the Metropolitan is bringing some paintings out of its basement that have been left there for decades. And at the same time, American artists of the 1890s and 1900s who had gone out of favor are being looked at again.
Pretty soon the Bronxville group will be known again.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, there was
maybe through the auspices of your book, too.
There was a very important show at the Hudson River Museum 2 years ago.
That's
the
right.
Artists of Bronxville covered almost all the same artists. And that was the first and only time since the 1913 exhibition at the Bronxville Library. That was the first time these artists had been shown together, the first chance anyone had to see them all in one room.
Now, was the curator of that exhibit, it was Barbara, who was the...
Barbara Ball-Buff, who
right, she was
lives in
helpful to you,
Scarsdale.
too, right?
And she was helpful, and she was researching the area at the same time Loretta Hoagland was researching it, and they would exchange their discoveries. She has contributed essays on 2 of the artists. If I can jump ahead.
Okay, well, why don't we go into some of the artists? I mean, I guess we're going to try and cover 5. You said really major ones.
Let me just add the dimensions of the book then. We got the main part of the text from Loretta, which covered the history, covers the architecture, the artists, and a bit of the social history of Bronxville, how Bronxville developed as a suburb, what the houses were like, all the staffs of servants that everyone had in their cottages, the schools they went to, the churches they went to. Really the core of Bronxville history as it developed is part of this book as well. But then beyond that, we wanted to specialize in the architecture and the artists. And so we have a chapter by 2 architectural historians on the architecture of William Bates, who was Lawrence's chosen architect and designed probably 2/3 of the early houses in Lawrence Park.
I hadn't realized that many.
Yeah, and he had designed houses all around the country, and most recently in Tuxedo Park. He did a handful of houses in Tuxedo Park. And then Lawrence and he were both from Monroe, Michigan, as was General Custer and his widow who lived here.
In the Remington Hotel before it was torn down, right?
Well, she lived there at the end. She had 2 houses in Lawrence Park before that, 20 Park Avenue and 6 Chestnut Avenue. So there's a cluster of people from Monroe, Michigan, other parts of Michigan that lived here, including Lawrence and his architect Bates. And so Bates is not maybe the top level of architect, but he's probably in the second rank of architect of this time. He's been mentioned in architectural histories of the period, but no one had done a monograph just on him. And
so this is a new part of the book too.
So this is a new part of Bates. It's a major contribution to architectural scholarship, I feel, to bring a large number of Bates's houses together with a study of his work and how he worked. And that's illustrated with pictures of details of houses and the fireplaces he did and the windows he did, all of which are fascinating as you
all
walk
the
through.
photography taken by mostly you.
Well, yes, that was as you walk through Lawrence Park. The key is just knowing what I wanted in the book. It was easier for me to get pictures in the book because I was picking the pictures.
Right.
So I tended to pick my own.
Now let's move into some of the artists.
And then for the artists as well, there was no one who, except Barbara Buff, who was again working on a thesis of these artists at the time, who really knew all of these artists. So I went out and found 7 or 8 art historians and gallery dealers who knew 1 or 2 of the artists each, and asked them to contribute short essays about each of the artists.
Oh, wonderful!
And
so they're in the book too. I mean.
Right. We have selected works by each of the artists. And that part, there's a chapter, it's sort of like an art book, you know, with the
little anthology on all these artists.
A painting, a typical painting by the artists, and then a 4-paragraph essay, what the artist's background was, where he or she studied, what major collections hold the artist's work, and a little analysis, was he or she a good artist, what was the style, was she an innovator, was she a follower? And so we have a little gallery then at the back of the book of these artists. And I say their houses are discussed throughout the book, and so now we have the artists and their artwork at the end.
How many artists in all did you cover? Did you end up doing this for?
They're probably about 25.
25.
They're 15 have separate essays devoted to them, and then another 10 that are mentioned in passing in the book, or whose works are shown in the book, but we don't have separate essays on them.
Now, you identified 5 artists in particular that you really thought stood out among the rest. And if I remember correctly, the first one was William Henry Howe. Tell us a little bit about Mr. Howe.
My selection is totally subjective. I mean, other person would pick 5 or 6 different artists. But Mr. Howe is important because he was the first artist to move to Bronxville. When asked how he discovered Bronxville, he said, well, I've been looking for a home for 6 months. He'd been in Europe the 10 years before. He had shown works of the Paris Salon, which was at that time the epitome of art acceptance. If you get your paintings accepted at the Paris Salon, was a major accomplishment. If you're a foreigner and accomplished it, was even greater. If you won a prize, which was very rare for an American, that was really the pinnacle. And Howe had won a prize at the Paris Salon. From 1883 to 1893, he exhibited at the Paris Salon. Then he returned to America and lived in New York City. And he said he spent 6 months looking for a place to live and build a studio. And he was riding the train one day, and he drove past this lovely area, and he asked the conductor what the name of that area was. And the conductor said Bronxville. And he got off at the next stop and came walking back and said, I want a house here. That's Howe's version of the story. Of course, Lawrence is saying that he's attracting all these artists here. But Howe came here in 1894, and this was his house that we saw before. And his specialty was painting cows.
Right.
And again, Bronxville was not full of cows at the time, but fortunately he brought with him a lot of his studies from Normandy and Holland of the cows he'd painted there. And he continued to paint the same cow over and over for 25, 30 years in Bronxville.
Now, there are a few of his paintings that you can see. Where are a few publicly displayed here in Bronxville?
The Reformed Church has one of his paintings, which is in the Hudson River Museum.
That's in the Edwards Room, yeah.
And the Bronxville Library has, I don't know if you can see it.
Is that Mr. Howe there? No.
Down here, but the painting down here is called White Cow, and that's in the main reading room at the Bronxville Public Library. Which actually was just been cleaned in the last 6 months, so it's even brighter and cheerier than it has been in the past.
There used to be a Howe right here. This is the village hall we're taping in the mayor's office, and there used to be one here. I guess they moved that over to the library. But this man did nothing but paint cows?
There's a famous story, probably apocryphal, but we're repeating as fact in our book, that he was, of course, known as Mr. Howe Cow because all I painted was cows, and he had needed some work done in his plumbing, and he made an arrangement with the plumber, which people sometimes still do rather than deal in cash, that I'll give you a painting of mine for the plumbing work you're going to do on the house. And so the plumber thought that was great because, again, Howe was one of the most prominent artists at the time. And he went about his work, and about a week later he came up to Mr. Howe and said, well, you know, Mr. Howe, this work, as plumbers often do, as I've gotten into the pipes, the work is a lot more extensive than I had originally anticipated. And Mr. Howe said, well, don't worry, I'll just paint another cow in the painting for you. So it was...
so he has a 2-cow painting.
Right, the plumber, wherever he is, has 2 cows in his painting.
That must be very special. It is rather unique for an individual to pick one subject matter and stick with it for his lifetime.
Yeah, like a certain lack of inventiveness, perhaps.
Well, when you've got a good thing going, maybe you should keep it.
Well,
now you,
unfortunately, he outlived its marketability about 20 years, and there really was not much market for his work.
But he's coming back in now. These things do not sell inexpensively today, right?
Well, the Hows, I don't know that there's been an upsurge in demand of Hows yet.
Well, when the cows become
become back, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as everything gets more industrialized, and that was the appeal of his kind of art in those days in Europe and here, as the Industrial Revolution occurred and cities got grimier, then people longed for the fresh air and the wholesomeness and the farm attitude. It was very fashionable in Europe to have paintings of cows or sheep or whatever in your Paris apartment to show that you had values other than just the grime of the city streets.
City. Now tell us a little bit about, you talked about Will Lowe earlier when we were talking. Tell us a little, he's another artist, right? What is his distinction?
Right, well he lived across the street from Mr. Howe. We have several excellent pictures, if I can point them out again on our sample layouts from the book. These three pictures over here show Mr. Lowe. The one on the left is in his studio at 25 Prescott Avenue, a studio that's still there and still used as a painter's studio by Carol Andrews today. And Lowe was studied in France also, and when he came back to America, he fell into a movement which is called the American Renaissance, which was designed to import the culture of Europe, the great capitals of Europe, Rome, Paris, London, to America. And at that time, the great mansions were being built in Newport, Rhode Island, along Fifth Avenue. And Lowe, along with Augustus St. Gaudens and John Lafarge, worked on the decorations of the Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue in the 50s, which at that time was considered the single greatest residence of an American, with no expenses spared, and every inch of every room either sculpted or muraled or stained glass to perfection. And that was the school that Lowe came out of. The picture that we saw in his studio before was a lunette that he was painting for the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel. Again, a lot of the great buildings by McKim, Mead, and White that were done at the turn of the century were illustrated with murals and paintings by Will Lowe.
And you mentioned he wrote in journals too, so his influence was far greater than just his paintings.
He wrote constantly and taught constantly and was a real leader in pretty much every artistic organization and society in New York at the time. And more than anyone else, he probably publicized Bronxville as a locale for artists, and to the extent there was a Bronxville school, it was because Lowe was telling people
to come out here.
That there was a Bronxville school.
William Van Dusen and Lawrence must have been very grateful or happy that this was occurring.
Oh, I'm sure it was. And again, they worked together. Lawrence, the story goes, built him this very large studio because Lowe didn't have any space in Manhattan that was large enough to do the mural work that he was doing, so he would go over to France every summer to work on his murals. And Lawrence said, I will build you this studio, which is, again, totally out of proportion to the house it sits on, but was perfect for the kind of large-scale painting that Lowe did.
And this was the fresh air retreat. I mean, the train was just beginning to come out here, right, I suppose?
No, the train was well established. The commute was exactly the same. It was a half-hour commute. There are 37 trains a day, same number as
37?
Same number there are today. The train service has not improved one bit from 1900. I'm either sorry to tell you or happy to tell you. We have strikes more often.
Well, you don't have to walk up the steps on the train anymore.
Right. No, so and most of these artists had studios in Manhattan, and many of their clients were in Manhattan, and they would have studios here and studios in New York. It was very convenient then, as it is now. And again, from Lowe's house, it's a 4-minute walk to the station.
Right. It must have been ideal.
Right.
Now, another artist was William Thomas Smedley. Tell us a little bit about.
Smedley was the third of the artists who lived at the corner of Lookout and Prescott and Wellington Circle, where Howe was on one corner, Lowe was on the other corner, and Smedley was on the third. And there were three remarkable gentlemen, and I don't really know how they coexisted so closely together. Smedley was one of the 2 or 3 leading illustrators of the day. And as you remember, in those days, magazines had illustrations. They didn't have photographs. This was before the advent of photojournalism.
Right.
And so if you wanted to do a story on travel or on a famous personage or on a social phenomenon, you hired an illustrator to do your drawings for your magazine, whether you're Scribner's or Harper's or The Century, the big volume magazines of the time. And Smedley, Frederick Remington was one, got his start illustrating that way. And Smedley, who was a friend of Remington's, also for about 15 or 20 years was considered one of the leading illustrators, especially of New York society scenes. He loved painting people all dressed up and at the ball or in the plaza.
He did portraits too.
In the Palm Room. And then later in his life, after he came out to Bronxville, he stopped illustrating about 1907 and became a portraitist and did wonderful portraits. The ones of men were principally official portraits, either a club president or the chairman of a society or a hospital. He did the governor of New Jersey and his family. He did the chief justice of the New York Court of Appeals, some congressmen, Supreme Court justices who wanted official portraits done. but he also did an equal number of wives, and really the portraits of the women are much more interesting. They're not overly flattering, but you really can see the personality of the woman. They're nice to look at,
You have a depth to them.
but they have a real sensitivity. In all his work, he showed a real sensitivity to the person he was depicting.
Now, the house he lives in is known as the Owl House, right? I mean,
Right.
Brendan Gill of the New Yorker lived in there, and
For many years.
Tom Smith and Adrian Smith live in there, I think, right now.
Right. No, it's a wonderful house, and it had a studio originally, and then the story goes the man next to Mr. Smedley, who was a famous inventor at the time named Ward Leonard, who had a factory down on the Bronx River and invented a motor car called the Knickerbocker. Well, he built a large two-car garage, the first garage in Lawrence Park to house his automobile. He built it right on the border of Smedley's property. And Smedley, the story goes, was very upset that his view had been spoiled by having this large garage placed there. So he immediately called for the contractor, and he built a second studio beyond his original studio, right on Leonard's border.
Even zoning problems in those days,
So,
right?
so it's about 3 feet apart from the Smedley studio and,
Right.
and the Leonard garage.
Yeah, I know it well. Now, there was one fairly famous woman artist amongst this group, too.
There were several. I don't want to belittle. There were several famous women artists. The best of the lot was Mary Lowe, who was the second wife of Will Lowe, and she had, coincidentally or not, she was married to Frederick McMonnies, who was the preeminent American sculptor of the time, and lived in Paris and Giverny, where she knew Claude Monet, and absorbed a lot of his impressionist style. And then, when Lowe's first wife, who was French, died, he had, we believe, secretly harbored affection for her ever since he had met her back in the 1870s when he was a student in France. He went back to France and found her, and she was at this time divorced from McMonnies, and said, "Come back to Bronxville, we have our own art colony back there, and bring your 2 daughters and be my wife." And so she came back to Bronxville, and she worked sometimes in his studio with him in Bronxville and sometimes at her own studio in New York. And she painted portraits of people, including many women, in Bronxville. And she also painted impressionist paintings, like as she had done in Giverny. And
We had one up here of, not irises, I can't even identify the flowers, but it was definitely Giverny. You know, you could tell it was impressionist.
And we're using in the book a lovely painting of the Duesenberry Gardens, which were on White Plains Road, that she painted after 1910 when she moved to Bronxville.
I look forward to seeing that one. I think we'll take one more artist, the Dinosaur Artist. I mean, you have to explain that. I'm sorry we can't cover them all, but tell us about the Dinosaur Artist.
Charles Robert Knight loved animals from his earliest childhood. He would skip school and just stay home and draw squirrels and mice and anything he'd find around the house. Unfortunately, he had a mother who would encourage his interest in art. And as he continued, he got older, he was also fortunate that his father was the private secretary to J.P. Morgan and had a lot of connections, including connections at the Museum of Natural History, where Knight was allowed to go and paint from their skeletons in the Museum of Animals. And while he was there, he met the chairman of the Department of Paleontology, who said, "Well, you're such a good artist of animals. Would you like to see what you can do with our dinosaur skeletons and try to draw some pictures of what you think dinosaurs would have been like back in the Pleistocene era, or whatever era the dinosaurs were
I'm impressed.
alive in." And he developed this field of dinosaur art, which you now see on cereal boxes and comics and
so
everywhere.
What we think of as a dinosaur was really maybe just his imagination a lot, or?
Oh, it was. I mean, that's the famous. There's a line in the book that he's the one that first did the famous painting of the Tyrannosaurus Rex looming over the Triceratops, a painting that's familiar to every boy who was ever a child.
Probably girls too.
And girls too, because it's almost a cliche, and that was his invention.
His original.
And it's a wonderful field because no one can say you're wrong because.
Do you have one of those in the book too?
No one showed it. No, we don't. We have what we have in the book. We have several things. We have a picture of him in his studio. He lived at 67 Park Avenue. We also have a picture of him sculpting a small elephant called Tiny, I believe it was, which is in the collection of the Bronxville Library, which was based on an elephant, a pygmy elephant that was the most popular attraction at the Bronx Zoo in those days. And that's one of the Bronxville Library's most prized art possessions.
Right, that's right. Now we could go, I wish we could go on longer and longer. We can't. But I just want to get a little bit out about this book. It's coming out in November. If we want to order it now, I mean, how do we go about how do we get this book?
Well, we would very much appreciate your ordering it now.
Funny that I should mention this.
Right, we are. It's being done at a very professional level, and we're going to be having it printed probably middle or end of July, and we need to raise the funds for the printing in advance. So because of that, we're offering a very attractive discount of $15 over the sale price.
This is the front page of it, then.
This is the title page, and these are all spreads from the book. The book will cost $55 when it's published, but it's available now for $40
if they act quickly.
If they act before July.
And now again, how do they order it?
They can order forms are available at Womrath's Recycled Ink.
They can go into Womrath's
on consignment. They're helping us out. You have to pick up an order form, and you either leave a check there or send a check into Chris Matlin, who's the treasurer of the project.
Or they can give you a check.
Or they can give me a check.
Or your mom and dad have often taken checks too for this book.
Sure, anyone on the Hilltop. The Village Hall, there are order forms available. And there will be an order form also in the next copy of the Village Bulletin, which will be in the mail in another week or so. But I hope that people don't forget about it or wait for the mail to come and then go off on summer vacation, because I think everybody in Bronxville who's interested in Bronxville would want a copy, at least one copy of this book, to look at themselves, to show to friends who visit them. It's a wonderful guide for a walking tour of Lawrence Park if you have a nice Sunday afternoon and want to go out for a walk and look at a major tourist attraction right in our midst.
Well, it is a major contribution to this community, and I know you have been really very modest about this. I know that Loretta's name is there. I don't even see yours on the title page, and yet I know from a lecture you've given that you have made a very major contribution to the book. And we thank you so much for making this contribution and also for joining us tonight.
Well, it's a pleasure. It was fun to work on the book. It's still fun to work on the book, and I love to get the word out, so I thank you very much for inviting me on your program.
Well, we wish you the best of luck. And we thank you for joining us tonight. I want to thank our cameraman, Bob Duffy, who is also the chairman of the Bronxville Cable TV Committee, and let you also know that this tape will be put into the archives of the library. Again, thank you very much, and good night.